On this episode of the William Hill Sports Book Club, we're reading the biography of Roy Francis, rugby's forgotten black leader.
It's about a guy who was born in a mixed race family, growing up in the 1920s and 1930s, and the struggles he faced and what he had to do to overcome those struggles. So it's a story about rugby, but it's also a story about an ordinary person overcoming the obstacles in their life.
Writer Tony Collins has put together a quality account of the life, the struggles, the successes of a black leader in a white world who revolutionised rugby coaching.
In terms of being a rugby league coach, he's the absolute pioneer. But in general terms, as a coach, he's one of the should be recognised as one of the leading figures in either rugby or football in that era.
And with a foreword by a rugby league legend, Martin Offiah, you know from the start that this is going to be a very special book.
There are so many great stories, and that's why I believe that this is a great story, because it's going to educate people that, what, you're trying to tell me that all this time ago, there were people that had a forward-thinking mindset and, are the reason why we are here and living in the world that we are today.
Roy Francis, rugby's forgotten black leader, is the subject of this episode of the William Hill Sports Book Club. Hi there, I'm Adrian Durham. It's the William Hill Sports Book Club, and if you've listened to talkSPORT over the years, you may well be aware that I am a lover of rugby league, big fan of Hull FC, and so when my co-host on this show, Neil Foggin, said to me, "Do you fancy doing the biography of Roy Francis?" Simple decision. That's a yes, please. Roy Francis, a huge figure in Hull FC's history, but more than that, he's a main character in the history of rugby league and a pioneer for black leaders in Britain. As a player, he was celebrated. As a coach, he was a revolutionary. As a human being, he suffered and he succeeded. It's a remarkable story. And Foggy, as ever is with me, you are a rugby league nut, aren't you?
Yes.
And there are so many figures from so many sports whose stories have not been told. Roy Francis was one of those. This story is one that just doesn't belong on the rugby shelves. It's a historical snapshot of a period of time, as well as a book about the sport, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's what makes this book special. So when it got entered, I looked at it and thought, do I read it? And I rang my dad. So I said to my dad, "Oh, we've got a book entered by Roy Francis." Oh, and my dad said, "Oh, he was my hero." And I never knew this. And my dad said, "Oh, I was at the Water Splash final and him and that team." And he says, "Just nobody knows his story." And it's quite sad that no one knows his story, because when you read this book, you just get taken back into that period of time.
Indeed you do, and don't take our word for it. The man who wrote the foreword to the book, the former Great Britain star Martin Offiah, who won it all with Widnes and Wigan, is with us. You describe Martin in the book as truly sensational in the foreword. How big an impact did the story of Roy Francis have on you?
It was big. I see myself a product of the sport of rugby league and rugby union, and when you delve back and you read some of these stories, you kind of give yourself a sense of, oh, things make sense. That's where it came from. The opportunity that I got playing for Widnes back in 1987, I just thought came out of nowhere. But I didn't realise the likes of Roy Francis, Billy Boston, and players like this had trod that path many years and decades before I decided to cross codes.
And when you do the foreword, you write in the foreword that it would make a great movie. It reads like a movie screenplay, and it actually would. You can actually see this on the big screen, can't you?
I have to doff my cap to Tony. He's done a great job reading that book. It was so enjoyable. I felt transported back to that time. Sometimes I'd lose sense of time and forgot that I was actually reading the book. It was like I felt like I was in a movie. I was making pictures in my mind, seeing how things were looking like. And the first thing I said to Tony after reading it was that, not only would I be honoured to write the foreword, but I thought it would make a great movie. I've always thought that rugby league has sometimes not got the attention that it deserves, but I always feel when it's a good human interest story, rugby league does jump out of the page.
Well, you mentioned Tony. It's Tony Collins, the author. He's here as well. You've written books on both codes of rugby, haven't you? How special do you rate this book and this story of Roy Francis?
I think that it's always special when you write about someone who embodies something, and especially something about sport. And I think Roy's story, and I consider myself lucky that I came across it, that Roy's story it's about the sport of rugby league. It's also in some ways about the sport of rugby union because he played both codes. But it's also, it's one of those great things. We often say that sport is about social history. And this is really that story. It's about a guy who was born in a mixed race family, growing up in the 1920s and 1930s and the struggles he faced and what he had to do to overcome those struggles. So it's a story about rugby, but it's also a story about an ordinary person overcoming obstacles in their life.
Well, I think it's important, if we give the brief background to this story, it's that Roy was the illegitimate son of a black preacher called Lionel, who went on to become a major political figure in the USA, which is a whole other story in itself, but that's in the book. Roy and his biological dad had no contact. He was brought up by a woman called Rebecca, who'd been married to Lionel, but who was not a blood relative of Roy. It was a chaotic start, but he had the love of a woman who brought him up, even though she wasn't actually his mother. Incredible story. Roy played rugby in South Wales, signed for Wigan as a teenager, left Wigan, in his opinion, because of the colour of his skin, went on to become a coach, wins the championship with Hull, eventually wins the Challenge Cup with Leeds in that 68 water splash final, had a spell coaching in Sydney where racism is rife as well, and that spell it's quite harrowing reading about everything that went on in Roy Francis's life when he went down under. And Tony, you sum it up with a quote from the end of the book, and the quote is this: "His was an extraordinary life of achievement unparalleled for his generation of working-class black Britons, one of the finest rugby league players of the 1940s, a creator of two of rugby league's greatest club sides, and the founder of modern rugby coaching. His name deserves to be elevated to one of the most important pioneers of sport and black British history." That's some credit you're giving him. That's some. It's a reference you're giving him, basically. It's an incredible story. He deserves all of that, doesn't he?
Yeah, I think when you look at his achievements as a player, because he was a great player, came to prominence in the war, and then he was so prominent during the war that he was actually selected to play for the England Rugby Union National Services team, which is that's kind of mind-blowing that he's playing rugby league for Dewsbury, but he's also playing for what is effectively during the war the England National Rugby Union side. And then as a coach, he is so innovative and forward-thinking and revolutionary in the methods that he uses. For example, he uses video analysis, which first person in Britain to do so, brings in professional sprint coaches.
When you say video analysis, we're talking 50s and...
This is like 1954, 1955. He gets a cine camera and he films matches, training sessions, and he does all the things that everybody in rugby and football today take for granted. But he was the first person to do that, and basically he did it from his own initiative because he wanted to find a better way of explaining to his players what they should be doing. And the other thing that's really important about Roy, and I think we might get into this later, is that he always treated his players with the utmost respect. He wasn't a coach who shouted and bawled at them from the sidelines or in the dressing room. Everything he did was about building respect, and I think that's because that's what he also wanted in his private life. The thing that often he was deprived of because of the colour of his skin was respect from other people. And I think that idea that respect is at the core of everything you should do is really what made him a success, both professionally and privately.
And interesting, Martin, I mean, I'm sure you'll have been in dressing rooms where coaches did ball out players at say, half-time. Actually, in Roy Francis's career, he was often criticised for not getting emotional at half-time and trying to ball out players to get things changed on the pitch. And I'm imagining that your experience was very different to that. How good would it be for a player to have a coach that actually is more respectful at half-time?
I think what Roy did back in that day is very similar to what's happened at Wigan today with like Matty Pete. I mean, we see a lot of modern coaches now. They're almost like life coaches, aren't they? They're creating a family. They're creating a safe space because, as Tony said, that's probably what Roy wanted. He wanted a safe space for himself. So he was creating what he wanted for his, I think Johnny Whiteley talked about that as well. He used to get the wives together, invite people around to his house, having barbecues, which was unheard of. And this was a black man doing this at a time where you don't have to be that educated to know that, we were living in a time then where, it wasn't easy for a man of his stature, a man of his colour, to do what he was doing in any other industry. I don't think it would have happened. And that's what I think is the beauty of the sport of rugby league. It wouldn't have happened in rugby union. It wouldn't happen in any other industry. But in rugby league, it did. And, I was taken in by the town of Widnes. I was taken in by the town of Wigan. And, I think I don't want to give too much of the book away, but the story that I found fascinating was that, he was taken in lodgings and ended up getting the daughter of the people who took him in pregnant, but still had a positive experience in that. And that's what I love about Wigan and some of these northern towns that don't really get the credit for leading inclusivity and, advancing the plight of black people.
Well, more than that, I mean, they got married and had a long-lasting marriage and a family. She went to the other side of the world with him, very supportive, and she was a kind of leader in that family spirit that Roy wanted to engender as a coach, wasn't she?
Very much so. I think, aspirations of what his mother, there are so many great stories, and that's why I believe that this is a great story, because it's going to educate people that, what, you're trying to tell me that all this time ago, there were people that had a forward-thinking mindset and, are the reason why we are here and living in the world that we are today, because people said, no, this is not right. Even though everyone else around us is doing this, this is what we stand for. I talked about it when I wrote my foreword about what happened in 1895. That took a certain mindset of people saying, no, this is not right. This shouldn't happen. And we want to create a fairer, juster society within the sport. And, that's what I believe Rugby League was looking to do.
Can we ask you a kind of technical question, if you like, about writing a foreword? When Tony came to you and asked you, I'm assuming he came to you and asked you to write the foreword, what were you thinking about how you were going to tackle it, that you had to read the book, that you had to write something really important? What was going through your mind in terms of the actual technical side of writing a foreword?
I'm not a writer. I've written a few things before, but I just wanted to be authentic, passionate and authentic. And I think recently, a few years ago, I had to narrate a piece for a Wigan little sort of mini poem. And I thought to myself, even then, I was on the same mindset as when I was on the pitch. When I was on the pitch and scoring tries, I was thinking to myself, I'm not only communicating with fans, I'm communicating with people watching it on TV, I'm communicating with people who aren't even born yet. And I thought this is going to be a timepiece, that this book is going to stand the test of time, and that I am communicating, not only my career and what I think and what I've got within me, but, from trying to get that book and trying to give it that something extra, so people think, oh, Martin Offiah's written this, what's he got to say? And so to really sort of be authentic with it, and there was a bit of me, I grew up in the 60s and 70s. I experienced a lot of, racism myself. I remember watching the movie Roots when it first came out. And, so there was everything in my existence that what I experienced on the pitch, what I've experienced as a parent. Yeah, so I tried to encompass everything into that short piece, and yeah.
Yeah, it's a great forward. And when Martin agreed to do it, Tony, first of all, very quickly, why did you want Martin to do it specifically, and how happy were you with what he'd written? Well, very happy with what he'd written. I thought it was excellent, because it's, as Martin said, it's one of the things I wanted to get over with the book is try to get inside Roy's mind, and the mind of the people who worked with him as well, who played under him. So I thought Martin did a great job in doing that for himself in the way that I wanted to do with Roy. And I wanted Martin to do it because, in a sense, there's a Martin's. I'm going to embarrass him here. Martin is the greatest English winger in the history of rugby of either code. And you can draw a direct line from Martin's achievements back to Roy Francis, and even further back to some of the back players who played rugby league before in the 1920s and 1930s. So it's really, I was so pleased Martin did it, because I really wanted to draw the fact that there is that long line of black players in rugby league who have been at the absolute top of the game since the 1930s. And, I'm not saying rugby league's a perfect sport and there's no racism or anything, but it is a record that's very different from any other sport, where you don't really get black players playing at the very top. I mean, for example, England, the first England football international was 1979 with Viv Anderson. England Rugby Union, really it's only in the 1980s. Welsh Rugby, it's only in the 1980s where things start to change. So in a sense, Martin's the ideal guy to sort of emphasise just that arc of a story that goes back to the 1920s, 1930s.
I definitely saw myself as a link between sort of the old world, the historical world that I read about, in the book and in other books, and the modern world. I played rugby union and rugby league in the 80s, 90s and 2000s. I've played in the amateur days of rugby union, and I've played in, the modern day Premiership, which my son has just started in. So I really did feel that I had a sort of sense of the sport, and because I like history as well, even when I did Mastermind, I was doing, very historical subjects, the history of the Second World War and the Battle of Britain. So I really have got a love for history. If anyone asked me what my favourite subject was at school, it would definitely be history, because I love history and how it pertains to me in the modern world. And, I'm a product of the fact that of 1895. If it wasn't happened, then there would just be a sport called rugby. There wouldn't be rugby league and rugby union. I played rugby union, and then I couldn't sort of play rugby union after I played rugby league, And then when you read about that and how that ties in with the Industrial Revolution and those northern towns and everything, it's fascinating. And this book is fascinating as well.
For me, with the forward, I read a lot of books, as we know. Sometimes there's a disconnect from the forward to the book. Yeah. And on this one, there was a connection, and you could tell Mike's read this. And he's passionate about this, and it makes, then you go into the book, you think, here we go. And sometimes you don't always get that in books.
No, it's true that the key is Martin clearly has read the book, and that's really important, and is very passionate. So it is a terrific forward. We're talking about the biography of Roy Francis on the William Hill Sports Book Club. It's the William Hill Sports Book Club. We're with Tony Collins, who's written the biography of Roy Francis, and Martin Offiah, one of the true greats who wrote the foreword to the book as well. Tony, there's some incredible research in there. How long did it take? How hard did you have to dig to find all of the... There's some great nuggets of information. When I talk about great nuggets of information, let me say that we found out in this book, and I won't give it away, no spoilers here, why Wigan fans are called pie eaters, and I never knew the real reason. You might think it's obvious, but it isn't obvious. So fascinating little bits of information. So did this all take a huge amount of time for you?
Well, from starting to actually coming out recently, it's probably about 4 years. And the reason for that is because once I started doing the research and talking to people who knew Roy, players who played under him, it just started to snowball. And so more and more information came to light. And then I managed to try and... it's interesting that Martin mentioned roots, because I thought, well, what I really want to do is try and find where Roy comes from, where his family comes from. So I did go quite far back, and certainly on his mother's side, you can trace them back to a woman who was held in slavery in the island of St Helena and in the Atlantic Ocean in the early 1800s. So it does go back a bit. But then also I tried to find out what happened to his father, because his father disappeared from the scene. And that took a long time of going through ship's records, passenger records, until all of a sudden, through sheer luck, I came across one document that actually said that he was attached to something called the UNIA, which turned out to be an organisation called the United Negro Association, which was led in the 1920s and 30s, led by a guy called Marcus Garvey, which claimed millions of members across America and the Caribbean. And Lionel Francis actually came to take over that organisation in the 1930s. So there's all sorts of things going on then. Roy's half-brother turned out to be a famous jazz musician who played with a band led by Snake Hips Johnson in the 1930s. So it took a long time, but that's because there was so much there, just to try and get to the bottom of the man, understand where the man came from, and how we relate to everybody. And the other thing was people wanted to talk about him. It's the number of houses I've visited and not left until about 3 or 4 hours later, because they've had so much to say about their experiences of working with Roy. It was just a privilege to write, to be honest.
Yeah, and you talk about luck there, but you earn your luck with the amount of work you put in, the contacts that you make. Did you have to have a cut-off point where I've got to get this down, I've got to get this published, this has got to... Because you could go on forever, couldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think the key for me was to be able to tell Roy's own life story. I mean, I could have gone on further to try and find out more about... His father came from Trinidad, And I actually spoke to a historian in Trinidad she tried to find out more about his origins, but we couldn't do anything. So basically I had to call time on that. But I felt that because of how helpful Roy's family had been, ex-players had been, I'd kind of got as far as I could with trying to understand the events of Roy's life and also understand how he coped with them, how he thought about them, tried to an attempt to try and get inside his head. And the nicest thing that was said about the book, including you guys, was from Roy's son, who said, "I recognise my father in that book," and I think that made me realise that I'd done a reasonable job, because he saw it wasn't the person that I created from the memories, the newspaper reports, and all the rest of it, was someone he recognised. And I think that's all he can do with the biography.
How did you feel when he said that? That's amazing.
It was kind of, in a sense, it was a relief, because obviously you don't want somebody to say, "That's not really my father." But I also felt that it was, I felt quite emotional about it, because the other thing that I never realised, what happens when you write a biography, is that you get very close to the person you're writing about. Yeah, I mean, I guess even if you don't particularly like them, I mean, although I'm sure I would have got on with Roy. And you feel a kind of responsibility to the family. That you feel almost as if you're the sort of chronicler of the family history. Because the other thing that I wasn't aware of until I started working on it is that Roy's family knew nothing about his time growing up, very little about his time in South Wales, certainly nothing about his father. And so, I was in the strange position of knowing more about somebody else's family life than they knew themselves. So it was a responsibility.
Yeah, it is such a good read. I'm pleased that the family have given you that endorsement. You talk about page 116, Tony. You describe Roy Francis as, quote, "a black leader in a white world." It's a very powerful description of Roy Francis. What led you to those words?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think the first thing is that one of the reasons why Roy was such a pioneer in the game was because he was the first black head coach, not just in rugby league, but I suspect in any British sport, certainly any British professional sport or any major British sport. So that's an outstanding achievement in itself. But then I think the other thing is that when you think about Britain, as Martin was saying earlier on, when you think about Britain in the 1950s and to some extent in the 1960s, black people weren't in positions of authority. It's almost impossible to imagine that a black person would be in charge of white people in the 1950s. And I tried to find examples of that, and there aren't really any examples.
Isn't the best sort of, it's not an example of it, but isn't the best way of describing that the Enoch Powell Rivers of Blood speech was essentially a racist speech from a well-known politician in Britain, was within a couple of weeks of Roy leading out a team at Wembley for the Challenge Cup final. Yeah,
I mean, that's a great irony. So in the summer of 1968, as you say, Enoch Powell made the infamous speech saying, basically, black people are going to take over. And then, literally, I think 3 weeks after, his Leeds at Wembley being led out by a black man. So it's so you can tell that the times are so different from what they are now. And for Roy to have gained the trust of those players and those officials, I mean, that's not to say he didn't have issues with racism, because he did sometimes in the game and quite a lot outside of the game. But he became the leader of those players and also of the families, because, as we were saying earlier on, Roy and his wife Rena were very keen on involving wives and families in the day-to-day business of the club. So so they got players could feel relaxed about their families being part of the club. And so Roy was not just the coach; he was the mentor. Johnny Whiteley, the great Hull player, told me how players would go to him for advice, not just about rugby, but personal things if they had problems at home or whatever, or advice on how to dress, what car to buy, what were the best shoes and things like that. So he became a mentor to in Hull and then in Leeds to essentially a group of working class white British blokes who would probably never had any interaction with black people at that point. But regardless of what prejudice they may have read in the papers or heard, they would follow Roy to the ends of the earth, and he was treated as they treated him as their leader. And so and it's quite a lot of the time players would say, well, I never had any racist comments within the team or anything untoward about Roy, not even behind his back or anything like that, because people just respected him. And they also knew that Roy wouldn't stand for it either. If people did make any remarks, they'd be out of the team. And that happened in an example that's in the book.
The South African.
With the South African player who turns up to play for Hull and says to Roy, in my country, you'd be carrying my bags. And never played first team rugby league for Hull. Largely because of that.
Incredible story. I think it was Johnny Whiteley's wife. I think I'm right in saying this off the top of my head here, just from reading the book, that she was told that there was somebody to see her, and then she was told it was somebody who was black, and she said, "I don't know anybody who's black," not realising they were talking about Roy Francis. So actually, they didn't really see that Roy Francis as a black man. They saw him as the coach of Hull FC at the time.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, you probably got something to say about this. I mean, I think that's kind of that's a double-edged thing, really, because it's almost saying, he's like an honorary white man. But I don't think that's really the way that he was that he was seen, because they were, he was very conscious of racism, and the players have said to me that there were certain things you knew that Roy wouldn't do. He wouldn't go into a pub on his own. If you ever said, "I'll meet you in such and such pub," he'd always say, "Oh no, let's go somewhere else," because he knew the danger of going for a black man to go into a pub on his own, particularly later on at night when people have had a bit to drink. It's problematic, to say the least. And the players are also aware of incidents like, for example, when he was turned away from hotels, when he tried to check into hotels in the 1950s. So players were aware of that. And I think when Johnny Whiteley's wife, Joan, said, "Oh, I don't know any black people," and then she realised it was Roy. It's kind of, I think she was probably reacting to kind of the stereotype that there was of black people at that time. That, as I say, they weren't in leadership positions. And stuff that they were portrayed in the media quite often as being inferior to white people. I think that's probably what Johnny's wife was getting at. But I think I think there's always a difficulty when people say, "Oh, I didn't realise he was black. Or I never thought of him as black." It's not quite as straightforward as that.
Well, from reading that section, Martin, I actually felt that what she was saying was that the narrative, the media narrative of portrayal of black people was very different to the actual lived reality that she had of knowing quite intimately, quite closely, a black guy in Roy Francis.
Because when you don't know somebody, you judge them on their appearance, but when you get to know and understand someone, you really get to know them as a human being and for their qualities. I was fortunate enough to be captained, mentored and coached by Ellery Hanley, one of the greatest players ever to play this great game. And, he was just a great individual. He was a leader, he was a born winner, a guy who's had success all over the world. And when you look at someone like him, he's just Ellery Hanley. I can appreciate how people would see him like that. Whereas if you just saw somebody on TV who you didn't know, then you'd put, "Oh, it's a black winger, or it's this or that." But when you get to know and understand people, and that's why I believe that sport has been a great unifier, because it's been very hard for people to still be negative towards a black player when he's playing for your club and scoring goals or scoring tries and giving you such immense joy. Also the way that restaurants and culture and food and music, these are all things which break down barriers, and then you just see it for what it is, its true self, rather than something distant. And then the only way you need to judge it, "Oh, that's black music," or "This is the Indian food," or "This is that," that's that. When you sort of embrace it, and I think that's the bit that I think came to me through the book, was that when you spent time with Roy, and he had that effect on you, you just saw him for somebody who was helping you to win, or helping to bring communities together, the team together. And bringing wives in, and what he did, I felt, during the war was phenomenal. And, I've had chats with people in Australia about his time at the North Sydney Bears and how Bob Fulton, really was coming to his house every week to really get an insight into what Roy had done in England. And, the Australians brought that back to our shore. So I wish Roy didn't go to Australia. Maybe we would have won the Ashes by now.
Yeah, who knows, later this year we may well do that. We are talking about the biography of Roy Francis, a rugby league legend. It's the William Hill Sportsbook Club. The William Hill Sportsbook Club. I'm Adrian Durham. Neil Foggin from William Hill is with us. Tony Collins, author of the biography of Roy Francis, and Martin Offiah, Great Britain legend, who wrote the foreword to the book. And we need to give a big standing ovation to Tony Collins. He's delivered some incredible stats and little facts in this book. I'll give you 3 examples here. Roy Francis's hull went 8 games without conceding a try. If only that were true of today's Hull FC team. Roy once played in a game for Barrow that had 79 scrums. Incredible. And at the end of the 58-59 season, Hull FC had to play 5 games in 11 days. Neil Foggin, can you imagine the battering those players' bodies took? 5 games in 11 days.
It wouldn't happen now, would it? There'd be an outcry that you had to play 5 games. But 78 scrums, and they were proper scrums back then to what we have now.
Oh, competitive scrums,
But
I also think that in terms of the rugby league content of the book, and I'm a big one for this, when I'm reading rugby league books, I want some rugby league content. Yes, of course, there's a great story about Roy Francis, his career and his life, but I need some rugby league content, and this book delivers that. Yes,
it takes you back into time. It shows you about rugby, but it's got that balance. The rugby league nuts in us are going to love it. But also you could give this to somebody who cannot stand rugby league, your mum or whoever, give them that and they will be taken back into time and they're given a history and a social lesson.
There's a summing up in the book on page 90 of Roy Francis's revolutionary coaching style. And if we just talk about that very briefly before, I want to get on to Wembley and how important it is, because Martin knows all about that, and how important it was to Roy Francis as well. But in terms of his coaching, the way he coached, Tony, it feels like it wouldn't be out of place in the modern game.
No, I think that's right. I think he was ahead of the game because partly for technical reasons. So he introduced video analysis. He brought in professional sprint coaches. He was very big on sports psychology, not in a kind of academic way, but he knew how to get the best out of players. And all the players I spoke to said, when Roy spoke to you, you listened, and you always came away thinking you were a better player. Even when he was telling you you're going to be transferred. I mean, that was an amazing thing that players would come out after being told they were going to be transferred to say, he's doing the right thing. I'm such a good player. It's the best thing for me in the club. So that kind of shows you how persuasive he was. But the other thing he did, and I think this is what links into the great football managers of the era, like Matt Busby, Joe Mercer, Stan Cullis, is that he was trained as a PT instructor in the army during World War II. And the training he had there in terms of both specific exercises for specific jobs, again, psychology, about physiology, what we today talk of as sports science or sports medicine. Roy had got that training in the army. And so when he came out, in a sense, he'd already done the degree. He'd already got it's not academic knowledge, but it's the technical knowledge. And when that was combined with his personality and his understanding of how to get the best out of players, that made him the university that he was. So I think when, if we're looking a bit broader than rugby league, you could say that when we talk about the great managers in football in the 50s and 60s, like Busby, Shankly, Mercer, Bill Nicholson, Roy's up there with them because he comes from the same background in a lot of ways, and he has that same rapport with his players. So just in terms of being a rugby league coach, he's the absolute pioneer. But in general terms, as a coach, he's should be recognised as one of the leading figures in either rugby or football in that era.
Do you think he gets the recognition he deserves? Do you think this book will help Martin with Roy Francis getting the recognition he deserves? Because there's a statue of him in his hometown, for example. He's in the Hall of Fame, I believe, Rugby League Hall of Fame. So there is some recognition. Is there enough?
I don't think there's enough. I don't think that the sport of rugby league really gets the recognition it deserves and how it has influenced the sport of rugby. You know, it's always been innovative, pushing the boundaries, and you know, and I believe that other sports have you know, taken its lead. But this is, as I say, it is a human interest story. It's telling Roy's story, which is a story worth being told, and I think people will get a lot from it. And I think, you know, the book is going to do a lot for the legacy of Roy Francis. We've seen recently that Billy Boston has got the first knighthood. You know, I've openly said it. You know, I don't know if they give knighthoods posthumously, but Roy definitely deserves one.
Yeah, I agree with that. Let's talk about Wembley, because I sense from the book that actually Roy Francis, even though he did win the Challenge Cup as a coach at Wembley, didn't really feel like he got the full glory from it. We'll come on to it in a second. But for those who aren't rugby league fans, let me tell you that being a rugby league fan, if you're a fan of a club and they win at Wembley in the Challenge Cup final, it is absolutely everything. And I speak as a Hull FC fan who, we went years without winning at Wembley. We thought it was never going to happen. We had so many opportunities to do it. We were favourites to do it on many occasions. There was a game against Hull KR, who Tony supports, and I can't believe we're so close in the room together. In 1980, Hull KR won that one. I'm still looking at the referee's performance, but that's the FC fan in me. Way back before that, there's a couple where Roy Francis was in charge, where a lot of people thought they would win, and they got absolutely battered. There's been times we were nilled in finals at Wembley as well. It's been a pure pain up until 2016, when Hull FC finally broke that duck and won at Wembley. And actually, for me as a sports fan of any sport, be it football, rugby league, whatever, that is the single greatest moments I've ever had as a sports fan. That's how much winning the Challenge Cup at Wembley means to me as a rugby league fan. So that's just my own personal view of it. Martin has won the Challenge Cup, scored an iconic try in a Challenge Cup final as well. Can you sum up what it means to win the Challenge Cup at Wembley? Because a lot of people talk about the grand final, and yeah, it's great, fantastic, huge crowd at Old Trafford. But for me, that Challenge Cup at Wembley means so much more.
I've mentioned on a few occasions that, you know, rugby league gets the press when it becomes a human interest story. Back in the day, before the grand final, that was the one day that you know, rugby league was seen by the whole nation. The Challenge Cup final live on BBC One, and you know, the colour, the pageantry. You know, you didn't get that at rugby union games. It was definitely, you know, you're either black and white, or you're red and white, or you're blue and white if you're Halifax. And, you know, it was full stadiums. And I do believe in the 1966 Challenge Cup final, there were more people at that final than there were watching England win the World Cup. If I'm
possibly, yeah.
To
pulled that out of nowhere.
No, I've definitely researched that. I've definitely read that somewhere. Yeah, it was a fantastic place to play. And I remember watching my first Challenge Cup final, I think on TV. And, you know, at that time, I don't think I was even thinking about coming to join rugby league. It was 85 when Hull FC, I think, were playing Wigan.
Why are you doing this to me?
And when they had, you know, Sterling versus Brett Kenny, the two Australian legends came over and were at each other. And yeah, it was great. So to actually to play in one, and the first time I played at Wembley was in the Ashes game in 1990. I was up witness for 4 years, didn't play in one. So when I actually got to play in one against Casford in 92, it was fantastic. And yeah, it was awesome. And obviously had my moment in 94, you know, which lives in the memory, and it's probably the most shown rugby league try ever, I think.
Yeah, if you haven't seen it, check it out. It is on YouTube, and it is iconic. Length of the field stuff from Martin Offiah. Hands over his face in celebration. I always thought that was just because you were tired after running the length of the field. Not true?
No, people may or may not know, or if you see my Instagram page, you'll definitely know. But on the morning of that final in 94, I woke up to a story in the Daily Mirror written by another rugby league legend called Alex Murphy, saying that I was finished and I was the best of a bad bunch, which is not bad motivation to go into a game with. I, you know, put that piece of paper, that story in my inside pocket, and went out. And yeah, so when I actually managed to score that, it was a moment for me, and I just wanted to have that moment to myself in a stadium full of 80,000+ people. I had a few seconds to myself before I think Andy Fowle and Phil Clark kind of tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Look, we've still got a game to win." And that's what I've always thought about try scoring. It's great, but doesn't mean so much if your team lose. So, yeah, I think that try wouldn't be remembered if we lost. I wanted to score a hat-trick at Wembley. I didn't achieve that. And other players, I think Robbie Paul was the first one to do it. But unfortunately, he did it on a losing Bradford Bull side. So it probably doesn't get remembered. So, I'm thankful to have my moment that will be remembered by. And now, obviously, the statue is up there with me in that same iconic pose.
Brilliant. And for those that don't know, just to be clear, they did win. He did score another try. So you can celebrate it and we can watch it over and over. Roy Francis took Hull to Wembley for Challenge Cup finals 2 years in succession. The first one they probably should have won. That was against Wigan as well. You weren't playing in that one. It was 1958, I think it was 59. And they lost, surprisingly. The second one, I think there were some really tough injuries for them, which is probably why they lost to Wakefield, I think it was. But that first one, I think probably shattered Roy a little bit because everybody thought they were going to win. Even his own players said he got it wrong. I think you say in the book he kind of miscalculated the whole event, really.
Yeah, and I think Roy had never played at Wembley. Hull had never played at Wembley either. So it was a new experience for the club and for Roy. And talking to Johnny Whiteley, who was the captain on the day, he felt that Roy had not appreciated how different Wembley is as a match. I know the coaches say it's just another game to us, but it's not. It's a different stadium. There's the occasion. There's everything about it makes it different. And so Johnny Whiteley felt that Hull had overtrained. They weren't relaxed. And then when they got to Wembley, they saw Wigan, and Wigan were very relaxed. And he said, a couple of players said to him, we're going to be in difficulties here. And unfortunately, that's what happened. They kind of over-prepared, didn't relax, and were beaten by a team that had a lot of experience at Wembley. And then the following year, they played Wakefield Trinity in a match, who they played at Wembley. They played the same club the week before and got absolutely battered. There were like 3 players who sustained injuries that ruled them out of the cup final. And Rugby
Highly
League...
suspicious, by the way.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the thing. On Rugby League folklore in Hull will tell you that Wakefield Trinity came out on that match beforehand to deliberately injure players. And so Hull were in such a bad way at Wembley for the cup final the following week that a player had to make his first team debut for the team, actually at Wembley. So that shows what dire straits they're in. And that really did scar Roy. And a couple of years later, he actually left the club and went to Leeds. So he felt deeply that he hadn't been able to show his brand of rugby league on the national stage, because obviously that's the one time that the Rugby League Cup final, it's on the BBC. It's sort of a national event. Certainly was in those days, and he wanted that national stage to just show how exciting and attractive his brand of rugby was, and. So he was really disheartened by that, and I think that took a lot of the steam out of his sails, and it kind of maybe eventually soured his relationship with Hull. And so he moved to Leeds in the early 60s, and then as a number of players at Leeds told me when I interviewed them, the one thing that he really wanted to do was to win at Wembley. This was his goal. And so that led, in 1968, he built this brilliant team. They played fantastic attacking rugby league. I call it in there, although Roy never called it that, total rugby league, because his idea of rugby league was kind of like the famous Dutch football team in the 1970s, where everybody, it didn't matter whether you're a full-back or what, everybody could attack, everybody could defend. And that's what Roy's rugby teams were. The forwards could run and handle like backs, and the backs could tackle as hard as the forwards could. And so he wanted to demonstrate that on the national stage, and that was Wembley in 1968, which became an iconic final for the wrong reasons.
It did, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment because it's worthy of more conversation, that 68 water splash final. We are talking about Roy Francis. The biography of Roy has been written by Tony Collins. It's the William Hill Sports Book Club. It's the William Hill Sports Book Club. We are talking about Roy Francis. His biography has been written by Tony Collins. Talking about Challenge Cup at Wembley and how big it is, why it's such an iconic moment. And Roy Francis, by the 60s, has already lost 2 Challenge Cup finals at Wembley with Hull FC. He's gone to Leeds. He's finally won it in 1968, Tony, but that water splash final, I mean, If you could briefly sum up what happened in that final, because it's an extraordinary thing. All rugby league fans know about it, don't they?
Yeah, it's a classic final for all the wrong reasons, because essentially a storm hit Wembley just before the match and then during the match, and rain absolutely monsooned down. And if you can see it on YouTube, it's basically the pitch is waterlogged, the players can't stand up, they can't hold onto the ball. It just becomes a lottery. And I think the most famous and certainly the most iconic event at the match was right at the very end. Leeds are winning 11-7, and there's basically no time to go. Wakefield kick off and score a try immediately from the kick-off. It's 11-10, so all Wakefield have to do is convert the try from under the post, and the cup's theirs. They'd win it 12-11. And yeah, again, I'm sure everybody who's watching this has heard of it or even seen it. That Don Fox, Wakefield Trinity player who was being named as man of the match just before he takes the kick, steps up to take the kick. He's a great kicker, great player, and misses from in front of the post. The referee blows the whistle. It's the end of the match. The Leeds have won. Leeds can't quite believe they've won. Some of the players are sort of embarrassed because they think Trinity have been the better team on the day. And they all agree that's not the way they wanted to win the cup. And Roy is actually sort of disheartened by it. He's achieved his dream of winning the cup, but not in the style that he wanted. So it's a kind of strange kind of glory. You've got the trophy, but you haven't been able to do the thing that you really wanted, which was to show just how fantastic it is to watch that Leeds Rugby League team. And so he doesn't really celebrate after the match. He doesn't go to the post-match dinner. He just goes to the hotel with his wife and has an early night, because it's kind of, he just felt tremendously disappointed and frustrated.
I've got to say, from a fan's point of view, if you win it when you don't deserve to, it's probably sweeter. There's something in that, isn't there?
Yeah. My dad always says it's the first time he ever swore in front of his dad was at the Wembley final, because he says this relief that they'd won the game. But yeah, it must be weird. But yeah, he wanted. But how do you deal with that as a player or as a coach? For you back, you've won something, but you feel you haven't done it the right way.
Can you get your head around that, Martin, with how you've won the cup, but you probably feel like you haven't properly won the cup? Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I know that when Wigan went on those runs, of 8 consecutive wins, after a while, it did become sort of almost like relief sometimes rather than adulation. I know for me personally, in '93, playing against my old club, Widnes, in that final when I got knocked out by Richard Ayres, who I think is he the second person to get sent off in a Wembley final? He was actual, up until then I thought he was a mate of mine. We've made up since. Gave me a big elbow. And I remember that day, even though we were winning, it was quite low. So I can appreciate sometimes when I didn't score in that game. I wasn't myself for most of it, so I was a bit of a passenger. So yeah, I can appreciate how if you want to win, but when you're a true champion, there's a way of winning. You don't want to win just because someone else did badly or someone else didn't do what they should have done. Obviously the conditions had played a part, and probably if it wasn't so wet, then Don Fox wouldn't have missed the kick.
Yeah, extraordinary final. Roy Francis finally winning the Challenge Cup. In between the Challenge Cup defeats with Hull and the Challenge Cup victory with Leeds, the book tells another story of how he had some sort of mental breakdown, nervous breakdown, which, I was not expecting this when I was reading it. I kind of had to put the book down for a second just to process exactly what we were talking about here. But I think it feels like it was the culmination of a lot of things from childhood right the way through to that point where he was at in his life. Plus losing twice at Wembley, I think, contributed to it. It might sound a little bit trivial, but I think it contributed to it. But it's a big, big moment in the book, isn't it?
Yeah, there was a lot going on in his life. So he'd lost twice at Wembley. Hull were on the decline. The club wasn't invested in players. And I guess he felt frustrated by that. But also, I think one of the things that quite possibly happened, and talking to his 2 sons, I think there's evidence for this, is that he just felt that tremendous pressure of being a black leader in a white world. And other than his wife, he basically had nobody to speak to about that. There was no, in today's world, there's support systems in place, but he had to bear all that on his own. And, I think, even the strongest character is going to buckle to some extent, having to bear all that. And also, I think because, as a black person in Britain at the time, within rugby league, by and large, he had no problems. Within his own club, because he was in charge, essentially the leader of the club, in charge of the club, then it was an environment that he could relax because he knew there wasn't going to be any racism, he wasn't going to get any discrimination or comments or anything like that. But once he stepped outside, then it was a different world. The other thing that was going on is obviously by that time he's in his mid-40s, his 2 sons have left home. So there's a kind of change in life, and he sort of, at that point, he's probably thinking, well, what am I going to do? He started to dabble in boxing. So he got a trainer's license from the British Board of Boxing Control, and actually was a trainer with quite a famous Tongan boxer at the time, who had come over to fight for championships. But that didn't really work out either. So I think that, in a sense, his dilemma was a fairly modern dilemma. In those days, nobody talked about mental health. And it was only his family who knew this, and the press was told the story. He'd had to go to a hospital because he had a long-standing injury from his playing days. But I think he was trying to cope with the things that a lot of ex-players, ex-professional footballers, rugby players, cricketers, obviously, the case of Graham Thorpe recently.
He did see a psychiatrist, didn't he?
He went to a psychiatrist. Yeah. He was in a hospital. He was admitted to a psychiatric hospital for about a week. In London, saw one of the leading psychiatric doctors, specialists at the time, who told Roy's wife, really, that he was the most complex case that he'd ever seen. But on the other hand, Roy was a very strong character, and he kind of recovered. When he recovered, he threw himself into coaching Leeds, and then he went to Australia. So it's sort of it's part of the human aspect of Roy, and the fact that although he was a great leader, he was a tremendous mentor, he still had his own demons to fight, and that wasn't always an easy fight, and it wasn't always something he could manage on his own.
Yeah, I sense that with the upbringing that he had, the childhood that he had, Martin, that's always going to be with you. Whether it comes back to haunt you is another matter, but it's always going to be with you. It's something that he had to almost like hide away and just forget about while he got on with being the brilliant coach that he became. But it's always there in the background, always going to be affecting him in some way.
Yeah, he obviously had a lot of baggage, obviously had a lot of success. And to do that, sometimes you do have to put things to the back of your mind. But, I think, as I said in the forward, he was a Superman, but, also he was very human. And, he succumbed like we all do eventually. Father Times, getting older, there was a lot of alcohol drunk at those times as well. A lot of references to pubs and drinking. I think didn't they own a pub?
Oh yeah, two at
different stages. So I'm sure there was a lot going on that people don't. When people think about history, we just think about conquerors and wars, and we don't think of human beings and how those harsh conditions must have affected them, and obviously they were a lot tougher back then, and you had to be resilient, and probably that's why they probably didn't live as long during those days. But for Roy, it must have been tough, when anytime things slowed down, or he had a moment, or maybe something happened that was not in the book because we've captured so much, but we must be thinking there must be so much that we didn't even capture, whether it was just a sly word or a thing or a look or a glance or certain things that that would affect us as human beings. We are all human, and that's what we mustn't forget. This is a book about a human being in a particular time in our history. Yeah,
you mentioned something earlier, Martin. I want to bring Neil in on this. That you talked about how there are so many human interest stories within rugby league, and it amazes me that there's not more rugby league books, Neil.
We don't get many for this award. I think we've fallen lucky in the last couple of years because of Sinfield and Rob Burrow. We've had their books, but it's very rare we get rugby league books. I don't know why. I don't know what happens, but they just don't seem to come in.
So get writing.
I already have them.
But can you understand why there's not more? Is because there are so many stories out there?
Yeah, I think it's partly because it's difficult to get a publisher, I think, for a mainstream publisher for rugby league books, because it's seen, rightly or wrongly, as a kind of niche sport that's based in the north. It obviously doesn't have the appeal to, if you like, the general reading public as something like cycling does, which obviously there's a lot of cycling books, or cricket, or even football to some extent. I think it is difficult for the game, as Martin was saying earlier on, just to get a bit of national PR spotlight on it. So, I mean, it's not for want of trying. I mean, there's some great books that have been written about rugby league over the years. And hopefully, this might, the Roy Francis biography might inspire more people and, inspire more publishers to take a look at rugby league books.
Yeah, what I would say is, having written a rugby league book myself as well, if you're wanting to make millions, it's probably not the way to go. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. It's a labour of love. And I think that it comes across that it's a labour of love for you in this book.
Yeah, it is, and it's not going to be the next Harry Potter, unfortunately. But I think the other thing, it is, as with a lot of rugby league books, for me it's quite a personal thing, because I'd come from Hull, and my parents grew up in the era that Roy Francis was the Hull coach, so they were part of that same world. So when I wrote about his time at Hull, I'm almost imagining how my parents and grandparents lived in Hull, because they lived 10-minute walk from the boulevard where everything went on for Roy's Hull Club, and were very much part of that local West Hull fishing community of trawlers and fish docks, which I try to describe in the book. So there's a little bit of my family history in there as well, and I think that's kind of, for books, it's important for an author to be able to feel something about the person or the situation they're writing about. Particularly about when we're talking about relatively recent history. So it's a personal book for me, as to some extent, is for the Francis family.
Well, you being steeped in West Hull makes me even more disappointed that you're a Rovers fan. So, listen, congratulations. It really is a stunning read, well researched, very well researched, and congratulations on it.
Thanks very much.
And thanks for joining us. And Martin, thank you very much for joining us, and for the brilliant foreword as well. It's been a privilege. And Neil, thank you very much. We will see you next time on the William Hill Sports Book Club.